A window cleaner was working at his usual height when a strange sound came from the skyscraper's ventilation. He decided to open the panel, and the moment he did, his face turned pale. Subscribe and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? The morning began the way it always did for Ryan Carter quiet, wind-stirred and suspended somewhere between the ground and the clouds. He arrived at the top platform of the Empire State Building before the sun had fully risen, when the city below still looked like a dim, sprawling constellation rather than a place full of people and movement. The air carried the chilled bite of an early hour, a thin sheet of cold brushing across metal railings and glass panels. Even through gloves, Ryan could feel the temperature of the building stone and steel storing silence like a vault. Routine came first. It always did. He checked the support anchors bolted into the rooftop frame, tested the tension of the primary rope, then the backup line, then the stabilizer. He ran his hand over each carabiner, felt the slight vibration in the cable as he gave it weight, and listened for the soft metallic ring that confirmed every point of contact was secure. Years of repetition had sharpened these instinctive checks into something nearly wordless inside him. A sequence of touches, pulls, and subtle sound recognition, all of it forming the boundary between life and the single fall that would erase him. The city still slept in places, glowing faintly beneath wisps of pale haze. It was a view that made people say they'd never get used to it, but Ryan already had. The height didn't soothe him or frighten him anymore. It just felt like where his body knew how to move. Ground level felt unnatural by comparison. Crowded sidewalks, too many intersecting voices, the clutter of shops and traffic. Up here, there were no crowds, no rush, just distance, just clarity, just work. He stepped into the suspended platform, the cleaning cradle that would lower him down the glass face of the tower. The cables hummed as he took his weight. His harness tugged slightly against his hips and ribs, tightening like a familiar reminder that he was tethered to something stronger than gravity. He leaned out, easing the cradle into motion, descending a few meters to the level where the job would begin. That was when he heard it, faint, like a low pulse or a slow mechanical drone, something that didn't belong to the usual orchestra of building sounds. He paused, letting the cradle steady. Wind made its usual soft shifts across the surface of the building, but beneath that, the sound had a different texture. Muted, intermittently rising, almost strained. He had heard odd noises before, loose panels, pressure shifts, vibrating steel, but this one had another quality, something disturbingly organic in its rhythm, like breath trying to force its way through machinery. He turned his head toward the source one of the narrow metal ventilation grills embedded between two window sections. Air ducts always produced some kind of resonance, but this one seemed deeper, as if coming from farther inside the system than usual. The noise wavered, dipped, then returned with a dull throb. He stayed still, letting the cradle settle so no part of it masked the sound, and listened again. It wasn't wind. It wasn't metal fatigue. It was too patterned, too heavy. A sound that didn't match any industrial signature he recognized. It made the cables beside him quiver faintly, as though the structure itself reacted. He leaned closer, placing one gloved hand against the grill. The vibration amplified at contact, traveling through the panel like something alive. He withdrew, pulse rising, not out of fear, but out of the quiet, alert curiosity that came when something broke the shape of normalcy. He continued working for the next half hour, telling himself it was probably a mechanical imbalance in the vents, maybe a failing fan. But the noise persisted, swelling and fading, as if whatever created it was moving. Eventually, it wasn't background anymore. It was presence. Ryan stopped pretending it was nothing. He lowered the cradle a little more until he was level with the small service ledge below the windows. He stepped off, with the confidence of someone who had spent half his working life dangling from high rises, then crouched beside the panel. He brushed dust away from its edges and noticed something immediately. 4 of the screws were old and paint-chipped, matching the original paneling, but 2 near the bottom were newer, too clean, too recent. That was wrong. The maintenance teams for this building were notorious for using whatever spare parts they had, not pristine replacements. Someone else had opened this panel. Someone who did not work officially for the building. Ryan retrieved a compact tool from his belt, a small hex key with interchangeable heads, then loosened the fresher screws first. A faint metallic creak followed, like the panel resisting movement. Then it gave way with a soft exhale of air from inside the shaft. He reached into one of the side pockets of his belt and pulled a small endoscopic camera A device he used at times to check behind exterior frames before loosening a panel. He fed the flexible line into the opening and watched the tiny screen clipped to his wrist. The inside of the shaft was darker than it should have been. Not dust and shadow, but absence. No reflective metal, no typical ducting. It was not a vent at all. It was a false cover for a space that was not documented anywhere on the building's engineering plans, at least not the public ones. The noise was louder now, no longer a vibration but something nearer to a human register, a guttural low sound that rose unevenly, as if someone were trying to breathe around a blockage. Something was beyond that panel, something alive. Ryan hesitated. He felt the weight of the sky behind him and the hollow steel cavity in front of him. His instinct said, "Leave it. Call maintenance again. Let someone with a badge deal with it." But there was no one here who would climb down the side of a skyscraper to check this. No one would listen to a report from a window cleaner twice. And there was the simple fact that he had heard enough emergency stories over the years, trapped workers, stuck animals, mechanical collapses, to know that sometimes a person found something because no one else could get to it. He widened the opening and leaned in far enough to see without the camera. A narrow passage descended at a slight angle, leading to a recessed panel in the inner wall, just out of reach from the base of the vent. No breeze, no system airflow, nothing functional. It was a space someone had built, not a space included in any blueprint. He climbed in. It wasn't graceful. He wedged his shoulder through, anchored a foot on the ledge, then shifted his weight inside the shaft. His cleaning harness line, still attached to the cradle, prevented him from falling backward, but the angle pressed the cold steel against his ribs. The smell changed immediately. Air inside the shaft was stale, touched with something chemical, something metallic. He crawled forward, knees scraping against the smooth surface, until his hand reached the inner panel. The metal was warm in places, like something behind it was powered or recently powered. He removed the second panel. This time, no screws, just a thin metal sheet held by 2 locking tabs. It opened into a room, a hidden room, a secret hollow gutted out of the interior architecture of one of the most famous buildings in the world. The first thing he registered was the dim light, a low electric glow from an old lamp in the corner. Then the shape of a table lined with stacked equipment, most of it outdated by decades but modified with new attachments. Coiled wires, plastic cases, notebooks, small analog meters with blinking orange indicators. Then his gaze shifted and stopped. A man lay on the floor, half propped against a pipe, wrists shackled to a steel radiator bolted into the wall. Skin pale, unshaven, dehydrated. Clothing tattered, but once expensive. His chest moved shallowly, but he was alive. Ryan froze, a sudden, vast awareness moving through him. The noise he had heard was not machinery. It had been a person, someone either unconscious or too weak to speak, breathing with difficulty inside the walls of a skyscraper. No one ever inspected this deeply. The man's eyes flickered open, clouded but aware. His lips parted, cracked from dryness, and a sound escaped, not quite a word, but heavy with warning. Ryan crossed the room quickly, scanning for weapons, traps, or devices before kneeling beside him. He checked the shackles, solid, heavy, not the type used for temporary restraint. He examined the man's conditioned thin arms, abrasion marks, signs of prolonged restraint. Someone had kept him here deliberately, not recently, but for a long time. He pulled a water pouch from his belt and let a few drops touch the man's lips. The man swallowed with visible effort, then leaned closer, forcing out a whisper that barely carried. It was not a plea for help. It was not gratitude. It was caution. Ryan felt, not heard, the meaning. Someone had planned this. Someone had access. Someone did not expect anyone to find him. He stood, scanning the rest of the room for identification, tools, notes, anything that would explain why a secret cell existed on the highest level of the Empire State Building. His gaze landed on the largest object in the room, a radio transmission unit. Not modern, not fully antique hybrid, a machine that did not belong in the present, but had been wired into it. Indicators blinked a rhythm, steady and deliberate, as if sending something outward. He took out his phone and began photographing everything methodically, the transmitter, the table, the modified electronics, the man's restraints. Last, he photographed the man's face, even though he already had a sinking sense that he had seen it before, somewhere, in a context that would make everything far worse. He did not have time to process that thought. He pulled the emergency call device from his belt and triggered the alert, knowing that once he did, his control of what happened next would be gone. He also knew he could not leave this man alone again. But the man, gathering the last of his strength, caught Ryan's sleeve and rasped one final warning, breathful, urgent, trembling with fear. "Don't trust them." The sound of his voice, even that faint, cut through Ryan harder than the cold air. Then the emergency responders came. They arrived too fast, too coordinated. They did not ask how he had found the room. They did not ask who he was. They asked only what he had touched, what he had moved, and whether he had taken anything. And something inside Ryan shifted very quietly, but permanently. Something was wrong, not with the man, not with the room, with the response. He watched as they took the man away. He watched as one of the responders placed a cloth over the transmitter, not shutting it off but covering it, as though visibility not function was the problem. He watched as they photographed the room but never once looked surprised. Then one of them asked him to sign a form, standard incident report, nothing unusual. But Ryan had been working high-rise maintenance too long to believe in coincidences. The man's warning echoed again and again through him, not as paranoia, but as the first piece of truth he was not supposed to have. When he finally stepped back out into open air, the wind felt different, and so did the height. He lowered the cradle toward the next set of windows, but work no longer lived at his fingertips. The city below no longer looked peaceful. The sky above no longer felt clean. He had found something he was never meant to find, and someone, somewhere, already knew he had. That was the moment the unease became certainty. Nothing about this rescue was supposed to be reported. Nothing about this man was supposed to be discovered. Nothing about this story was supposed to reach the outside world. And yet, because of him, it now had a witness. He stared down at the city, at the millions of windows catching faint reflections of the rising light, and felt the quiet beginning of a threat he could not yet name. He just knew the world beneath him had shifted, and whatever came next would not wait long to reach him. The sound in the vent had been the beginning. Everything after it was already consequence, and he had just stepped into a story that did not want him in it. By the time Ryan reached the street, the world had resumed its ordinary rhythm, but his mind hadn't. The sirens, the flashing lights, the rigid men in pale uniforms, all of it, had happened too quickly, too perfectly rehearsed. The city absorbed incidents like this every day, yet this one had been sealed from the moment it began. The elevator attendants hadn't asked questions, the security guards had kept their expressions deliberately blank, and the paramedics, if that's what they were, had moved with military precision. Something about the way they handled the man, the way they shielded the radio device with a single cloth instead of deactivating it, had felt rehearsed, as if they weren't saving anyone at all, but securing an object. He returned home with the restless energy of someone whose mind wouldn't stay quiet. His small apartment on the Lower East Side felt different, smaller somehow, as if he had brought the weight of that hidden room with him. He powered on his laptop, still wearing his work clothes, and began typing notes, while the images were fresh in his mind. The shape of the radiator, the model number on the transmitter, the pattern of dust disturbed along the floor where someone had moved recently. He listed the man's features in cold detail: dark hair streaked with gray, thin jaw, a mark near the left temple, a once expensive wristwatch still fastened too loosely on a swollen wrist. Then he opened the news feeds. Nothing. No mention of a rescue, no report of emergency teams responding to the Empire State Building, not even a rumor on the local channels. Normally, a medical evacuation from that landmark would ignite social media within minutes, but the feeds were silent, as if the day had never happened. The first ripples of unease turned to confirmation when he checked the internal maintenance log from his employer. The entry for the call he had made, flagged as anomalous noise report, was still there, but the attached emergency alert he had triggered had vanished. He reached for his phone to double-check the photographs he'd taken, only to find half of them gone. Not just deleted, corrupted. The thumbnails were there, but when opened, they turned into blank screens of digital gray. The few remaining images still showed what he remembered: the man in the shadows, the radiator, the old transmitter with its amber lights blinking. He backed up what remained onto a flash drive, though the system hesitated as if something invisible interfered. A soft, static hum whispered through the speakers for a second before the transfer completed. He pulled the plug and shut the device down. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Unable to stay still, he moved to his bookshelf and pulled out the old laptop he used only for emergencies, disconnected from any network, slow but clean. There he transferred the few surviving files and began to zoom in on the man's face. He knew that face, not personally but from headlines. It took only a moment to confirm what his memory already suspected. Walter Hale, the missing billionaire whose disappearance had consumed the financial pages almost a year ago. There had been speculation kidnapping, self-exile, corporate sabotage, but the case had dissolved when no ransom appeared, and the authorities quietly declared it a private matter. Now Ryan was sure the man chained in the walls of that skyscraper was him. He leaned back, staring at the frozen image of the exhausted face, the watch, the faint reflection of a blinking light behind him. He remembered the man's warning: don't trust them. At the time, it had sounded paranoid, a fevered whisper from someone traumatized, but now it echoed with clarity. Whoever had taken Hale had enough reach to erase the incident from public view within hours. The rescue team had worked too cleanly. Their uniforms had no hospital insignia, and they hadn't bothered to ask how long the man had been there. They'd known already. Night crept in unnoticed, wrapping the apartment in thin blue shadow. Ryan couldn't sleep. The image of the transmitter kept circling back its layered design, old tubes connected to new ports, the quiet pulse that seemed to never stop. He pulled out a printed schematic of the Empire State Building's ventilation systems that he kept from a past job. He traced the approximate path of the shaft where he had found the hidden space. It didn't exist on the plan. That section of the building was supposed to contain sealed utility columns, not accessible ducts. Someone had modified it deliberately. Someone had built a secret within a monument. By midnight, curiosity had won over caution. He packed his climbing harness, flashlight, a small digital recorder, and the endoscopic camera again. The thought of going back terrified him, but not as much as the thought of leaving the truth buried. He waited until the night security rotations would be light, then made his way back to Midtown. The Empire State Building loomed like an immense shadow against the clouded sky. He knew every access point by heart. The side service door near 34th Street, the freight elevators, the stairwell that reached the roof maintenance zone. He moved quietly, blending with the hum of late-shift workers who still came and went through the loading dock. The building's roof was nearly deserted. A cold wind scraped across the metal railing, and the city lights stretched beneath him like veins of gold. He secured his rope system to the anchor bolts, checked his harness, and lowered himself toward the section of the facade he had visited that morning. The city was silent below, a motionless sea of lights. His movements were steady, practiced. He counted the floors automatically, each level sliding upward past him until he reached the same ledge. The panel was still there. The screws were gone. The sheet of metal hung slightly ajar, revealing the faint flicker of light from within. His heartbeat climbed. He lifted the panel just enough to peer inside. The narrow corridor beyond was cleaner than before, less dust, fewer signs of neglect, but it carried a strange smell, sharp and chemical, like fresh disinfectant covering decay. He crawled in carefully, the metal groaning faintly beneath his weight, and reached the second panel. This one had been replaced but not fully sealed. He slipped it free and stepped into the hidden room once again. The difference was immediate. Someone had been here. Someone had erased traces of what he'd found. The radiator still gleamed against the wall, but the shackles were gone. The floor bore streaks of fresh cleaning solution. The table that had held the transmitter was almost bare now, except for a small pile of objects, a worn, leather-bound notebook, a set of magnetic data cartridges, and the transmitter itself still active, emitting a dim pulse through the indicator lights. The sound returned, too, faint and constant, like a heartbeat made of static. It had not stopped transmitting since the moment he left. Ryan crossed the room slowly, touching nothing, yet memorizing everything. The air carried a faint electric warmth. He knelt beside the table and looked closer at the transmitter. It had been modified, further extra wiring now snaked from its back into the wall, disappearing into conduits that hadn't existed that morning. The hum synchronized in intervals, repeating with mathematical precision. He reached into his pocket for a small RF scanner, switched it on, and watched the readings dance. The frequencies jumped across bands, cycling through multiple languages embedded in bursts of coded sound. Fragments of French, Russian, and Arabic syllables layered within electronic distortion. It wasn't random noise, it was deliberate communication. He flipped open the leather notebook, careful not to smudge the edges. The handwriting inside was meticulous, dated and written with a disciplined hand. Lines of numbers, letters, and short notations filled each page. Time codes repeated along the margins, so 3:15, so 7:40, 11C, 15:20. Each one had a word beside it: check, confirm, mirror, reply. The entries spanned years, but the last few were fresh. Whoever maintained this device had been doing it recently. The final date was 2 days before Ryan had heard the sound for the first time. The handwriting had changed slightly in those last pages, as though another person had taken over. He slipped the notebook into a sealed bag, took out his camera, and captured every angle of the room: the transmitter, the wiring, the floor, the stains that had escaped the cleaners. Beneath the table, he found one more object, a small plastic drive taped to the underside. He pried it loose, turned it over, and saw the faint stamp of a recent manufacturing label. This wasn't an artifact from the 1960s. It was new. He pocketed the drive, then turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. Something glimmered faintly on the floor near the radiator, half hidden in the shadow. He knelt and picked it up. A footprint. Not an actual shoe, but a residue of oil shaped like one-its tread pattern, distinct, professional, designed for tactical traction. He photographed it, too. The pattern matched the kind used by private security contractors, not building maintenance staff. When he finally stepped back into the night, the The wind struck colder than before. The city no longer seemed to breathe beneath him. It stared. He descended slowly, every movement deliberate, every cable vibration sounding too loud. At the ground level, he felt the presence of motion before he saw it. A van idled across the street, engine running, no logo on its side. The silhouette of a person sat behind the wheel, head turned toward him. He didn't linger to confirm. He slipped through the loading entrance and into the maze of corridors that led to the main lobby, exiting through a side door that fed into the blur of late-night pedestrians. When he turned back once more, the van was gone. Back in his apartment, exhaustion gave way to grim focus. He powered up the isolated laptop again and inserted the recovered drive. It held only one file, a sequence of encrypted data bursts, each tagged with a date and time identical to the handwritten entries in the notebook. The data translated into shortwave frequencies and message identifiers. He recognized the format from historical archives he'd read long ago. Numbers stations. Cold War-era code systems used for transmitting information to field agents. But this version was digital, using modern packet structures. It wasn't a relic. It was active. He spent the next hours cross-referencing the timestamps with public financial records. What he found began to twist the edges of reason. Every transmission time coincided with major fluctuations in global markets, the release of sensitive corporate information, the sudden rise or drop in key stocks. Each pulse from that transmitter could have been a signal, a coded instruction to trigger massive trades executed through algorithmic systems worldwide. The Empire State Building, a symbol of stability and commerce, had been broadcasting the heartbeat of a hidden economy. When the first pale glow of dawn touched the windows, Ryan sat back, eyes burning. He had enough evidence to prove that something monumental and illegal was happening, something that tied together espionage, finance, and technology. But proof meant nothing if he didn't survive long enough to show it. A sound at the door froze him. A light scrape, subtle but deliberate. He reached for the small flashlight on his desk, turned it off instead, and stood in silence. The scrape came again, then a soft thud against the floor outside, followed by footsteps fading down the hall. He waited several minutes before opening the door. A plain white envelope lay on the floor, unmarked, sealed without postage. Inside was a single photograph, his own window-cleaning cradle, dangling outside the Empire State Building. Taken from above. Underneath, a handwritten line. Last climb. The world inside him seemed to tilt. They knew who he was, what he'd seen, where he worked. The message wasn't warning. It was ownership. He closed the door, locked it twice, and stood in the quiet that followed, listening for anything that didn't belong. The city outside was waking, cars moving, horns sounding, but he no longer heard it the same way. Somewhere in that noise was a frequency only a few could hear. And now, he was one of them. Ryan sat down slowly and began writing out a plan. He would not go to the police. He would not contact the building's management or even his employer. There was no one left he could trust. The only thing left was to finish what he had started, to trace the signal to its end and pull the truth into light, no matter who tried to stop him. Outside, the morning sky shifted from gray to pale gold. The Empire State Building stood against it, indifferent, immense, and silent, its windows flashing back the sunlight like 1,000 watchful eyes. And Ryan Carter, alone in his apartment, knew that whatever was hiding inside that tower had only begun to reveal itself. The hours after the envelope arrived settled into a heavy silence, one that felt less like quiet and more like a held breath. Ryan no longer questioned whether someone was watching him. The photograph had made that clear. The question now was how far their reach went, how long they had been tracking him, and whether he had already made a mistake by keeping the remaining evidence in his apartment. He sat with that thought longer than comfort allowed, running his hand over the sealed flash drive and the notebook he had taken from the hidden room. Both felt heavier now, as if they carried not only data but a countdown. He spent the early morning studying the contents of the notebook in greater depth, its pages unfolded not like a diary, but like a ledger of operations. Each date aligned with transmission windows, each frequency shift marked with a meticulous hand. Now that he had cross-referenced the timestamps with public data, patterns emerged. On the days when the signals were strongest, the market had reacted spikes in stock volume, sudden sell-offs, unexplained rises in technology futures. None of it visible to the average citizen, but unmistakable to someone who knew to correlate the data. Someone was using a Cold War communication system to move billions. Not through wire transfers or open trading floors, but through coded signals that could trigger algorithmic trading actions across different countries. It was a perfect system, untraceable, deniable, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look, which meant the hidden room in the Empire State Building wasn't just a leftover relic. It was a functioning node in an international network one that someone had gone to extreme lengths to keep operational. The thought of Walter Hale surfaced again, the man weakened, chained, and barely conscious. A billionaire did not vanish without someone powerful benefiting from the absence. Ryan searched archival records, pulling up articles, shareholder reports, and statements from Hale's former company. The shift had come shortly after his disappearance. Control of the firm had passed to an interim council led by a single figure, Julian Cole. The name appeared in news feeds with a strangely neutral tone, the subtle praise used for someone who stepped into a vacuum without raising suspicion. Ryan dug deeper and found what the surface articles didn't mention. Cole had ties to a private security conglomerate, one involved in asset recovery, high-risk protection, and more relevantly, facility containment services, a phrase vague enough to hide anything. The footprint on the floor of the hidden room returned to his mind. The tread pattern had matched a type of tactical boot sold exclusively to corporate contractors. It meant the men who had taken Hale, the ones who had cleaned the room, and the ones who had sent him the envelope could all be linked back to the same operation. This wasn't a government extraction or a rescue. It was containment. Hale had been held there not because he was forgotten, but because he was needed. He opened the recovered audio files and filtered out static, isolating fragments of speech buried in the signals. The voices were not conversational. They were structured, mechanical, recited by speakers with neutral tone, series of numbers and short phrases. 1031. Prepare shift. Confirm sequence. They were not instructions for people in the field. They were keys to synchronize events, a financial trigger system disguised as radio noise. But the most unsettling discovery came when he slowed one of the later recordings and amplified the background. Beneath the coded message, faint but present, was the sound of a breathing monitor, a soft metronome like a medical machine tracking life signs. Someone had broadcast over the sound of Hale's breathing. The system wasn't only using him financially, it was tracking him. The next step had become inevitable. If Julian Cole and his network were using the transmitter for market manipulation and Hale's biometric identity as a safeguard to unlock accounts, then stealing Hale's access meant more than kidnapping. It meant controlling hundreds of millions that couldn't be seized through legal or hostile corporate takeover. Hale hadn't been eliminated because he was still valuable. He had been disappearing in increments, used until the last password, voice print, or authorization failed. The more Ryan understood, the more he saw how deeply layered the game was. Private security operating outside regulation. A billionaire rendered voiceless and hidden. An espionage-era signal repurposed for financial warfare. A city full of people who passed the Empire State Building every day, unaware that one of the most iconic towers in the world was being used as a silent command hub. He paused to breathe. Even the thought of confronting such a machine felt impossible. He was a window cleaner, someone whose daily concern was gravity and safety knots, not global crime. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse. He had stepped inside the hidden space. He had made himself a variable in a system designed to have no witnesses. Whatever happened now, he was already part of it. His phone buzzed suddenly. He reached for it, but the screen was blank. Not ringing, not flashing. The vibration was artificial, a ghost signal from a device tampered with. That confirmed it. Someone had attempted remote access again. He turned the phone off, removed the battery, and placed it inside an old metal cigar tin crude shielding, but enough to block basic tracking. The knock at the door that followed was soft, polite, too polite. He didn't answer. A moment of silence passed, then footsteps retreated down the hall. When he opened the door a minute later, another envelope waited on the floor. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "We need to talk." Beneath it, an address. No signature. He didn't go. Instead, he packed, not to run, but to prepare. He took the notebook, the flash drive, and printed stills from the surviving photographs. He placed copies of the transmitter log and Hale's image onto 3 separate drives, one for a trusted friend he rarely saw, one for a journalist who owed him a favor, and one for a place no one would expect. An abandoned storage unit outside the city where he sometimes kept old cleaning equipment. If he disappeared, the information wouldn't. Before leaving, he paused by the window looking out across Manhattan. The dawn was beginning again, pale light dragging across rooftops, glass towers waking with reflections. Somewhere down there was the van that had watched him. Somewhere above him, at the 100th floor of the Empire State Building, the transmitter was still alive, pulsing like a quiet engine of power. He didn't know who hunted him most urgently now, Cole's private force, an intelligence agency that wanted the station for itself, or a financial entity built on manipulation of invisible trades. But the truth had sharpened. They were not just after Hale. They were after control. Control of markets, control of identity, control of silence. And now, because he had seen the room and taken what wasn't meant to be touched, they were after him. He pulled the strap of his pack over his shoulder and locked the apartment door behind him. He no longer thought like a worker going to a job. He thought like someone being followed. He didn't take the subway. He didn't use main streets. He moved through the city the way he'd been trained to move along its towers, quietly, observing angles, trusting instinct more than habit. The next stage of this wouldn't take place inside his apartment. It would take place where the signals still lived, where someone was still transmitting instructions to willing receivers. He had to go back into the building not as a witness this time, but as someone who understood what was at stake. The transmitter wasn't just a secret. It was a weapon, and whoever controlled it controlled more than a man in chains. The city around him pulsed with life as he walked, but Ryan felt none of its warmth anymore. The world he had stepped into, the silent world of coded frequencies, financial warfare, and disappearing men, had already begun to close its circle around him. He just wasn't ready to let it close completely. The decision to go back inside the Empire State Building was not one Ryan made lightly, but by the time night came again, there was no room left for hesitation. He had spent the day assembling everything he had: images, recordings, backups, names, timelines, and distributing them in careful fragments to people who would not recognize their value until they had to. The envelopes were sealed, the drives hidden, the message drafted and scheduled with a single condition: release if I do not confirm in 48 hours. It was the closest thing to insurance he could create. Not protection, but consequence. The world outside looked unchanged, but for him, every streetlight felt like a lens, every window like an eye. He moved with purpose, a man who had accepted the danger rather than outrun it. His pack now held not only climbing gear, but items chosen with precision: insulated pouches, spare ropes, a compact cutting blade, a portable RF meter, adhesive tape, a screwdriver with interchangeable bits, and a steel container lined with shielding foil meant for the transmitter core he intended to retrieve. He reached the building close to midnight when foot traffic had diminished to passing taxis and the last clusters of exhausted workers leaving late shifts. No one noticed him enter through the loading bay entrance. Workers in reflective vests still moved crates and carts, paying him no more attention than they did any other man in dirty work clothes. He had learned long ago that visibility was not about being seen, but about blending into something no one looked at twice. The freight elevator carried him upward, stopping on a service floor near the roof access. The silence there was thicker, broken only by the hum of distant machinery and the occasional clatter of pipes settling against changing temperatures. He slipped through the mechanical room, unlocked the small maintenance hatch leading to the exterior platform, and stepped out into open air. The night was colder than the last, clouds pulling across the sky in slow, disjointed bands. The city lights glittered below him, fractured into reflections across the building's glass skin. He clipped into the anchors, fed the rope through the descent device, and swung himself outward into the void. Gravity pulled him down the side of the tower, and the wind cut against his jacket in sharp gusts, but the movement felt familiar, almost welcome. Here, suspended above the city, he was not hunted. Here, he was simply alone, and for a moment, that was enough. He descended to the same floor, guided by instinct as much as memory. The ventilation panel was exactly where he had left it, but something was different. The metal had been wiped clean, no fingerprints, no dust. The space around it carried the faint scent of latex and solvent. Someone had been here again, more recently than he expected. But the screws had not been replaced. Whoever cleaned it had assumed no one else would return. He drew out his tools, unscrewed the panel, and leaned into the shaft. The darkness inside was no longer simply absence. It was occupied. The air had a warm electrical weight to it, sharper than before, as if recently disturbed. He crawled through the narrow channel and reached the inner barrier. The second panel was sealed, but only loosely. He pried it open and slipped inside. The room was no longer abandoned. The transmitter still sat on the table, but now it was connected to a secondary device, a portable crypto modem encased in black composite, small enough to be moved quickly. The wiring had been rerouted, running into a temporary power supply rather than the wall. Someone was preparing to extract the system. The notebooks were gone. The cassettes were gone. Only the main core remained, still blinking, still sending data into whatever network listened from afar. He approached the device slowly and set down the insulated container. His intent was simple: take the core and prevent the station from being used again. But the moment he reached for the wiring, something shifted above him. Not a sound at first, just a change in the air pressure, the way a room feels when a door opens on a floor above. He turned off his headlamp and froze. Voices. Not loud, not careless. Two men. Their footsteps moved with trained precision. No chatter, no hesitation, no wasted motion. He heard the soft click of a weapon being readied, the kind meant to be silent. They were not checking the room, they were coming to secure it. He moved quickly, disconnecting the transmitter core with 3 quick motions, twisting the latch, severing the secondary power line, detaching the data coupling. A faint alarm tone emitted from inside the casing, not loud enough to be heard beyond the room, but loud enough to trigger a response. The footsteps paused. A voice muttered something clipped and final. He didn't wait for a second chance. He slipped the core into the metal container, sealed it, and slid it into his pack just as the first shadow crossed the threshold of the panel. Ryan didn't stay to confirm whether the man saw him. He turned, braced himself against the wall, and rolled out of the shaft onto the exterior ledge, pressing flat against the building face. He didn't breathe. The cold cut into his fingers as he reached for the rope line still anchored nearby. His gloves nearly slipped on the glass, but instinct locked them into place. The men inside spoke again, sharp and tense, searching the room. The sound of a panel being ripped free hit the metal frame, followed by the low pulse of a silenced weapon fired into walls testing for presence. They knew someone had been there. They just didn't know where he'd gone. Ryan hooked into the rope, pushed himself outward, and began his descent. Not smoothly this time, but fast, a controlled drop down the side of the tower. The sudden speed sent wind roaring past his ears, and the tremor of the line vibrated through the harness. His boots struck the next ledge too hard, nearly throwing him off, but he caught the cable and steadied himself. Above him, one of the men leaned out through the opening, searching the facade. Ryan swung sideways, using momentum to shift toward a service balcony farther down. The angle was steep, the margin small. If he missed, the fall would be final. He calculated distance in a single breath, then released the rope and dropped the last few meters onto the metal grating of the balcony. The impact rattled his bones. He bit back a noise and crouched low. The men returned inside. For now they had lost him, but they would not give up. They had seen how the panel had been opened. They would track access logs, hallway cameras, service elevator footage. Everything he had done was now part of their footage. The only advantage he had left was speed. He moved through the balcony door and into the internal mechanics level, navigating the narrow corridors until he reached a service stairwell. His heart still pounded from the descent, but the rhythm was steady, not panicked. He had done what he came for. He had the transmitter core. They could no longer send whatever signal they relied on, not from this location. But that thought did not comfort him the way it should have. For every node shut down, there could be another. And the people he had just outrun were not thieves. They were custodians of something vast and coordinated, something that did not pause just because one part of it had been interrupted. He exited through the freight hall again, moving with caution, checking every intersection before crossing it. By the time he reached the street, the wind carried the distant wail of a siren, but not for him. A delivery truck backed into the curb. A passerby smoked beneath a street lamp. The city wore its normal face. Only when he turned the corner did he see the dark van again. This time it wasn't parked. It was tracking him. He cut left through an alley, climbed a chain-link fence, and dropped into a rear courtyard. The van accelerated, searching for an angle. He kept low, ducking behind dumpsters, crossing through half-lit spaces most civilians avoided at night. The metal container in his pack weighed on him like a beacon, and the men inside the van weren't the type to give up. They had a purpose, a mission. A single failure would not stop them. He didn't go home. He moved across the city until he reached a neighborhood where cameras were sparse and alleys narrow. There, in the back of a silent auto shop, he knocked on a rusted side door. A tired man answered. Someone who had once worked with him on a construction job years ago. Someone who wouldn't ask questions. Ryan handed him a sealed envelope and a plain flash drive. No explanation. Just instruction. If I don't come back, make sure someone sees this. The man nodded, not fully understanding but feeling the weight of it. He left again before the man could speak. One more drop site waited, the message to the journalist, set with a timer, and another for regulators, already packaged and ready, needing only a single command to send. The hunt would intensify now. He understood that, but whatever happened next would no longer be quiet. A system built on silence had been forced to echo. He walked deeper into the night, not knowing whether the next street held safety or a trap, only that he could not stop, not until he finished the one thing still within his power. He had taken the heart of their signal, and somewhere, someone with power, someone who had always been unseen, would feel the absence. Whether they reacted by retreat or retaliation would be the final measure of the scale he had just disturbed. Morning came like a fragile truce after a sleepless night. Ryan hadn't been home for 2 days, and the city was beginning to blur into a single nervous rhythm of neon, rain, and exhaust. The transmitter core sat in the steel container at his feet, silent but far from harmless. It was the one thing everyone wanted, the proof, the leverage, the danger condensed into a single object. The moment he had taken it, the balance had shifted. He was no longer an accidental witness. He was evidence himself. He sat in a dim motel room that smelled of old paint and disinfectant, tracing his next moves across a page of notes. Everything depended on timing now. He had to make the information impossible to bury. If even one person could replicate the transmissions or decrypt their pattern, the story would surface. And that meant creating multiple keys, multiple routes that would keep the truth alive even if he vanished. His phone remained disassembled on the counter. The laptop hummed weakly beside him, its screen covered in lists, names, frequencies, financial spikes, dates, all pieces of the same puzzle he had stolen from the shadows of the Empire State Building. At noon, he sent the first package. The journalist received a series of files marked Archive 1, containing the photographs, the notebook scans, and recordings of the signal patterns. The transmission logs went to a second source, a small group of independent market analysts with a reputation for exposing insider algorithms. The third package, encrypted and heavily disguised, was routed to an international financial oversight body. If even one of those reached the right hands, silence would no longer be an option. The waiting was harder than the action. Every passing sound made him look toward the door. Trucks, footsteps, a door creak from the hall, all of them merged into the sound of pursuit. When the first news alert appeared on his screen an hour later, his hands trembled as he read. A leak had broken. An anonymous whistleblower had revealed evidence of a covert communication system hidden inside a landmark skyscraper. The article was cautious, avoiding specifics, but it was enough. Within minutes, other outlets began circling, quoting unnamed sources, speculating about espionage and market manipulation. It had begun. Then came the second wave. The footage from the building's security system, partially redacted, surfaced on a fringe media site. It showed figures in plain uniforms carrying a man on a stretcher, Walter Hale. The timestamp matched the day of the supposed rescue. Another clip showed the same men loading sealed containers into an unmarked van. The headline below was simple. Who are the medics? The question ignited everything. By evening, the story had spread beyond control. Major networks picked it up, and the government issued statements promising investigation. The Empire State Building was evacuated for security inspection, and footage of the operation filled every channel. The noise Ryan had tried to amplify now roared through the world, but beneath the satisfaction was dread. The men who had built this machine, who had silenced every voice that threatened them, were not gone. They were simply adjusting their focus. He followed the chaos from the motel room. Reports of raids began, offices of private security firms sealed, executives summoned for questioning, files confiscated. Julian Cole's name appeared briefly in a financial disclosure, then vanished from subsequent reports. Someone had erased him, or he had erased himself. But others were caught technicians, intermediaries, front companies. The system had cracked open, and those who maintained it were scrambling to escape the light. Late that night, a message came through an encrypted channel he hadn't used in years. A simple text. He's alive. It was unsigned, but the timing left no doubt. Hale had survived. He had resurfaced under government protection, guarded and monitored. The brief news segment that followed confirmed it. Walter Hale, once presumed dead, had issued a short statement through an attorney, confirming that he had been held against his will and exploited for biometric access to financial accounts. His voice was hoarse, but the implication was devastating. The conspiracy was real, and it was over, at least on paper. For the first time in days, Ryan let himself exhale. He had done what he set out to do, but peace was not what followed. In the next hour, His email accounts were flooded with strange notifications, failed login attempts, decryption requests, remote access warnings. He pulled the power cord from the laptop and sat in darkness. The story was out, but exposure did not mean safety. The network that had built the transmitter might have lost a node, but not its reach. The following morning brought headlines that should have felt like victory. Global scandal unfolds. Covert financial network exposed. Empire State Building at center of espionage probe. Yet behind the noise, the reality was quieter, more ambiguous. Some reports contradicted others. Some vanished between one update and the next. Names were censored, files retracted, interviews replaced with no comment. Even the journalist he had trusted released a follow-up piece that downplayed her own sources. The machine was already absorbing the blow, patching its wounds. Ryan left the motel before sunrise. The air outside carried a strange stillness after the storm. He walked through empty streets, past the same coffee shop where he used to stop before work, past the intersection where the city always began to hum at dawn. Everything looked unchanged. But in his reflection, in every glass surface he passed, he could see the difference. He had become part of a story that would never have an ending, because the truth he uncovered was too large to contain in a single revelation. He spent the next hours erasing himself, discarding devices, changing clothes, withdrawing cash in small amounts. He avoided cameras, stayed to alleys and service routes, places only maintenance workers used. When he finally reached the Hudson, the river wind carried the scent of salt and machinery. He watched ferries move in the distance, people going to their jobs, unaware that the city they trusted had been a shell for invisible empires. The world did not stop turning because one man shouted the truth, but it shifted, imperceptibly, and the tremor would travel further than he ever could. Days later, the Empire State Building reopened to the public. Tourists lined the observation decks again, taking photographs of the skyline. No one mentioned the sealed ventilation ducts or the temporary closures of certain floors. The building's owners released a statement calling the reports a misunderstanding born of outdated infrastructure. The words sounded hollow, but they were official, and people preferred comfort over unease. Ryan returned once more to the Heights. Not to that hidden room, not to investigate, but to work. The company had assigned him to another skyscraper across the river, but he could see the Empire State Building clearly from there, its spire shining like nothing had ever happened. He worked in silence, letting the rhythm of motion calm his thoughts. Yet something inside him refused to rest. When the wind picked up that afternoon, he set his bucket down and opened his pack. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was the small metallic module, the final piece of the transmitter that he had never turned over, the one he had promised himself he'd destroy. But he hadn't. He had kept it, unsure why, unsure whether it was guilt or caution. The device still bore the faint mark of heat from when it had last been active. He stared at it, then at the skyline beyond, the world of glass and concrete where invisible hands moved fortunes and lives. He thought of what it meant to keep a secret that powerful, to be the only one left who truly understood the depth of what had been built. He turned the module over in his hand, feeling the faint click of a hidden switch. The light on its side blinked once, almost imperceptibly. Then again, regular, rhythmic, a heartbeat. He didn't move for a long time. The wind howled, the rope shifted under his weight, and the city glistened in the fading sun. He could have dropped the module, let it vanish into the streets below, but his fingers closed around it instead. Some truths, he thought, never really die. They just change their frequency. And far above the city, amid the noise of wind and steel, a man who had once been a window cleaner stood suspended between the ground and the sky, holding the silence that the world had tried so hard to forget. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one, because the next chapter might be even darker. Share this video with someone who loves a good mystery, and check out the other stories waiting for you on this channel. Trust me, you won't want to be the last to know what happens next.